Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back and thank you so much for your continued support. Blaster casters are one of the more contentious topics in Pathfinder Online discussions. There is this notion that single target damage is purely the domain of marshals, and that spellcasters simply cannot choose to have access to it no matter what they do. There's even discussions on whether this is fair or whether spellcasters deserve access to this or not. Now, this notion does have quite a bit of underlying truth to it. Back when the game first came out, and for a good chunk of its life, blasters were really not that good at single target damage. You could, with a ton of effort, get a build that could perhaps barely keep up with range marshals and single target damage, but it would require the use of, say, uncommon spells like Sudden Bolt, or the use of the Psychic class specifically and not be accessible to other classes. This, however, has changed in the past couple years of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Rage of Elements came out with a ton of new blasting spells, which give blasters a lot of different ways of expressing their character concept. Player Core 1 and 2, as part of the Remaster of Pathfinder, also improved a lot of the classes and made them better at blasting as a baseline, as well as adding a few good blasting spells in their spell list. All in all, today, if somebody wants to build a blaster caster, they can. They can build a blaster. It'll keep up with the damage that range marshals do. It'll have its own upsides over the damage those range marshals do to reflect their upsides. If you're okay with blowing all your resources, you will even get to do melee levels of damage while still standing far away at range. There are a lot of good reasons to be a spellcaster-based damage dealer in this game now. Yet that notion still persists. Advice is still built around that notion that you should always focus on things that are not single target damage in spellcaster and simply not worry about single target damage. That is what's giving rise to this video series. It's going to be a three-parter, where in the first part, which is today's video, I will be talking about how I like to evaluate different blaster casters, how I decide when one of them is good or one of them is not so good, how I decide when they need backup options and when they don't. In part 2 of this video series, I will then be applying the metrics I develop in this video to evaluate various blaster casters, high-level analyses of classes and subclasses to see who makes for a good blaster based on the criteria that I've established and who doesn't. And finally, in the third video, I'll be going in-depth in a couple of the blasters that I consider the best in the game. I'll give advice on how I would build them level by level, how I would play them turn by turn, and what modifications you can make to customize this character in your own way without taking away from his blasting capabilities. The third video will also be accompanied by a detailed written build guide for all of the builds I present in that video, which will only be accessible to channel members. So if you haven't yet joined a channel membership, joining one now is a good way to directly support me without worrying about ads or anything of the sort, as well as getting access to a few extra goodies, like those build guides that I mentioned. All that being said, let's get into today's video. Before we can start evaluating the performance of individual blaster casters, we should first establish what even is the role of a blaster caster. We're going to do this by looking at the 5 fundamental axes. If you need a refresher on what I'm talking about, take a look at this video above. In that video, I established the 5 fundamental axes along which I like to evaluate everything in this game. So as a refresher, I had stated that marshals are, generally speaking, the more efficient and sustainable ones. They tend to do their things in 1+1+1 action bursts rather than in 2 action plus 1 action bursts, and they tend to not consume daily resources for what they do. There are exceptions like the alchemist, but generally this is true. Casters, on the other hand, have the higher potency, higher reliability, and higher versatility. The versatility comes from the fact that spellcasters can kind of achieve anything with their spell slots. The potency and reliability come from using max rank spell slots when it comes to damage, and then just any spell slot when it comes to things that are not damage, and lets casters punch way above their weight to offset the fact that they're spending a resource on what they do. All this makes sense. All this is pretty well known if you've been watching my channel for a while. However, these axes are not set in stone. They're general guidelines, and I have alluded to this fact in the past because I mentioned that while marshals may be efficient and sustainable, melee damage dealing marshals change that equation a little bit, don't they? Melee martials will trade down on efficiency and sustainability. The efficiency loss comes from the fact that they're required to run into melee. They don't have the best target selection. They are often getting knocked prone or having enemies that can inflict crowd control on them. And their sustainability comes from the fact that they usually need somebody helping them take the hits, because you can't really survive in the front line for too long in a difficult encounter in Pathfinder. So you need heal spells, or you need someone else spending resources to make sure you don't take too much damage. This trade down on efficiency and sustainability means they trade up on potency and reliability. Their potency comes from the fact that they do a ton more damage in melee, and they tend to have significantly stronger skill actions, mainly the athletics maneuvers, and their reliability comes from the fact that flanking is really easy for them to get. At low levels, they even exceed the potency and reliability of slotted spells, though at higher levels this is not true. So if melee martials can change the equation for what a martial usually does, how are blasters going to be changing their equation? A blaster is trading down on versatility. This is usually by choice. They're choosing to blast with most or all of their spell slots rather than do the huge variety of things spellcasters can do. So it's simple. All you have to do is gain something to make it worth it. Just like how the melee martials make losing efficiency and sustainability worth it by gaining potency and reliability, you can gain something in return to make that loss of versatility worth it. So now your role and your spot in the party is most comparable to ranged martials. They will continue beating you in efficiency and sustainability overall. So how do you make up for the loss in versatility? Perhaps you can make your Blastercaster as efficient as a ranged martial is. Or you can double down on potency and reliability. Maybe you just don't bother catching up to their efficiency, but you have extra explosive turns via just having too many max rank spell slots. Or maybe you're incredibly reliable because everything you do targets saves and you never worry about the multiple attack penalty. So the overall role of a Blastercaster is to deal damage at range while trading down on versatility for other benefits. If you're not getting other benefits in return for the versatility you're choosing to lose, it's not going to make for a very good Blastercaster, because at that point, just go back to being a normal spellcaster. So what makes for a good Blastercaster? Now that we've established that blasters are occupying a similar niche as ranged martials, but they're giving up on one of the biggest upsides spellcasters usually have over those ranged martials, how do you justify trading down on your versatility? First, the fundamentals. You don't need every single one of these fundamentals to be good, but the more of these you have, the better you will be at blasting. It is worth noting that a lot of these fundamentals have significant overlap with just the general fundamentals of playing an offensively oriented spellcaster, and that's not a coincidence. The first is the ability to target as many defenses as you can. Armor class, reflex, fortitude, and will are the 4 major defenses in this game. Knowing when to target one, knowing when it's worth trying to figure out what the enemy's lowest defense is to target that, versus simply figuring out what the enemy's highest defense is and then just avoiding that, knowing the interplay between all of these is a very important part of being a good blaster. Secondly, spells that can brute force through enemy defenses. These are more necessary the less good you are at point 1. For example, a primal spellcaster may struggle to target will, so if you're against a foe that has high reflex and high fortitude, you might just want to use Horizon Thunder Sphere and try to do an attack roll, because armor class is a bit less swingy than these other saves, right? So having some ability to brute force through enemy defenses by massively increasing your reliability or getting auto effect spells is really important. Then there's having multiple damage types. You want to have a bare minimum of 2, because otherwise resistances and immunities can really mess you up. The more you have, however, the better it is. And to be honest, most spellcasters can easily have 3 to 4 damage types, so it's not too big an issue. Just pick your spells wisely based on that. Remember that your goal is not to just avoid resistances and immunities, it's also to occasionally trigger weaknesses. And you can't do that if you meet just the bare minimum of 2, right? Then you perhaps want to consider having a variety of rider effects to accompany your blast. To some extent, this is like negating your versatility loss. For example, as a spellcaster, you might miss being able to cast Revealing Light, which can just directly dazzle foes. But having spells like Ignite Fireworks that attach dazzle as a rider to a good blast is pretty good. So the more riders you have, the better you can negate that versatility loss I was talking about earlier. Finally, the last fundamental is some way to gain value from your lower rank non-blasting slots. A blaster really does need to figure out what they want to do with it. This can be stuff like Sure Strike to support your blasting, or it can be out of combat utility, or it can be purely defensive reactions, or it can even be just more blasting, like a spell like Brine Dragon's Bile. Whatever you choose, make sure you come in with a plan for those spell slots, because you're not going to be using them directly to do your main blasts. They have to have some other plan going on. So these 5 are the fundamentals. You receive the majority of your fundamentals simply from choosing the right spell list. The worse your spell list is at fulfilling these fundamentals, the more you need to gain from your class and subclass features and focus spells to make sure you're at least good with most of these fundamentals. Now, there's the more direct portion of this. When you trade down on versatility, what are you gaining along the other 4 axes? First, let's talk about efficiency. One of the best ways blaster casters can get this is to weaponize their third action. Their best spells are often going to be 2 actions. Say you're casting Thunderstrike or Fireball. That third action is where you can generate a lot of efficiency. If you have a 1-action focus spell, or better still, a 1-action focus cantrip like the Silence in Snow Witch's Hex cantrip, you can really squeeze in a ton of value on your turn, because it's very easy for you to just not worry about the multiple attack penalty and use all 3 actions offensively. Very few range marshals can gain that efficiency by using all 3 actions offensively while still keeping their reliability up. Flurry rangers, of course, can, but not every range marshal can. There are other ways to increase your efficiency too. Reaction spells, for example, using reactions to defend yourself so that you don't need to run away from melee, because you can just stay where you are, keep turreting and blasting with all 3 actions, and use your reactions to protect yourself. This becomes easier and easier to do as you reach higher and higher levels. Reactions can also be used offensively via spells like Brine Dragon's Bile. Brine Dragon's Bile is an incredible way to just stick some damage onto anyone else's turn using a reaction, as long as somebody's dealing slashing or piercing damage in your party. Then you can try using sustain spells. If you use a 2 or 3 action spell on turn 1, that then generates value throughout the combat for the cost of a single action each turn, you're now able to use all of your actions offensively. Spells like Floating Flame, Cinder Swarm, Freezing Rain, etc. can be really good at doing this. And then, of course, you can just increase your party's efficiency. Being self-sufficient with regards to your mobility, your range, and your defenses can really reduce demand on the rest of your party, in particular your party's healer. And this is a boost to your whole party's efficiency, not necessarily just your own, but you will still feel it. You will still feel like your party works more like a well-oiled machine if you're self-sufficient in your defenses. As with the defensive reactions I mentioned earlier, it becomes easier and easier to be self-sufficient in your defenses as you get to higher and higher levels. The next axis to consider is potency. Class-specific damage boosts like Sorceress Potency, Blood Magic, Unleash Psyche, etc. can be a really good way of increasing your potency, and they're pretty straightforward, so they're the ones that come to mind first. The other main straightforward way are just simply having a lot of maximum rank spell slots. Because max rank spell slots tend to be rare, they tend to do disproportionately more damage than is normal for your level. So if you have more of those, you're simply going to be a better damage dealer. And then beyond these 2 straightforward options, it can get a little hazy. There are ways to have explosive turns that rely on efficiency, say a witch using Cackle. There are ways to have explosive turns that rely on simply having a generically amazing focus spell. I'll discuss more of them when we get into some of the specific builds in video number 2, but for now, just think of the 2 obvious ways and just remember that there are other ways of gaining potency. Then consider reliability boosts. Basic saves are, of course, the main reliability boost that spellcasters have, but there are other less obvious ways of generating reliability. Repeating damage again and again over the course of a combat at the cost of just 1 spell slot, say via a sustain spell, is a really good way to increase your reliability. In this regard, reliability and efficiency can often go hand in hand, and I will be talking about this coupling a little more later. Another thing to do is spreading damage across many d20 rolls. When there are many d20 rolls happening, you become less likely to suffer from a string of bad luck. So a spellcaster that on its turn simply makes one attack roll is going to be less reliable than a spellcaster who, say, makes one attack roll and asks the enemy for one basic save. And then that spellcaster is going to be less reliable than somebody who does even more d20 rolls on their turn to increase their damage's reliability. And then finally, there's sustainability. Sustainability tends to be one of the harder factors for blaster casters to get good at. The remaining three are things that spellcasters are naturally good at, so it's not too hard to find optimizations that make you better in those regards. But if you're able to increase your sustainability, it really shows, because now you're a blaster caster that can deal with strange adventuring days where you have 6-7 combats without worrying too much about it. Now, you will notice that a lot of these factors come coupled with one another. You may notice that a lot of these fundamentals lead to reliability. You may notice that potency is often opposed to the other factors. These are not coincidences. Pathfinder tends to be a balanced game, which means you cannot make a character that's going to be excellent in every single one of these regards. Somewhere or the other, they will pay the cost. In the next few slides, I will talk about how these factors coupling can sometimes cause them to increase or decrease one another. Sometimes there's tension, sometimes there's synergy, and all of these together can define your character. The biggest area where this tension, this coupling pops up is the spectrum of spike damage versus continuous damage. What do these two terms mean? Spike damage is something I have talked about on this channel before. This is also something Arcade Mark has talked about in a really good video that I like to keep linking to, so I'm going to link above. What this means is basically doing a big chunk of damage all at once within the span of a single turn, and bonus points if we're able to get the spike on demand. For example, by spending a maximum rank spell slot. This tends to be high potency and low sustainability when it comes from a spellcaster. This is not necessarily true for a martial. For example, a gunslinger's spike damage has no sustainability cost really, but it is always true for a spellcaster's spikes. Spikes will consume daily resources or at least focus points when it comes to spellcasters. Alongside having a resource cost, spike damage generally tends to also trade down a little on reliability or efficiency. For example, you might have a turn where you go Sure Strike plus a 2-action attack spell. This is a huge spike, which you paid for by consuming resources, so lowering your sustainability, and lowering your efficiency, because now you spent your entire turn making this one singular attack roll. You didn't get to move, you didn't get to sustain other spells, you didn't get to use Recall Knowledge or Demoralize. All you did was Sure Strike into that attack spell that Sure Strike was just an auxiliary action for. So spike damage is always high potency, always trades down on sustainability when it comes to spellcasters, and generally trades down on one of the other areas too. And continuous damage is the other end of the spectrum. Rather than doing one big chunk of damage all at once, this is the ability to do damage continually over the course of a combat, round after round, turn after turn, action after action. This is often measured as DPR, but remember, the DPR alone cannot be that good a metric. It has to be a metric you use alongside a lot of other metrics to make sense. Usually, continuous damage is just a natural consequence of having high reliability and efficiency. Think of what tends to have higher DPR in context of Pathfinder. For example, if you have 2 actions available, making 2 strikes with them tends to be a higher DPR than simply using both those actions on one single meta strike, like Vicious Swing or even Spell Strike. Likewise, a spellcaster using basic save spells will have a higher DPR than somebody using attack trait spells. So continuous damage is often just the consequence of high reliability and high efficiency. Sustainability also tends to be higher for a character focused on continuous damage. Think of a spellcaster that wants to do continuous damage. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Using a sustain spell, using a spell that you cast on turn 1, and then it keeps pinging away like a floating flame or a cinder swarm. That one action you use can then be combined with other 2 action options like cantrips or focus spells, or even slotted spells if you think the combat needs it. But the point is that because you're using that one spell to generate so much value turn after turn, your sustainability went up. So reliability and efficiency naturally lead to higher continuous damage, and the playstyle generally leans towards a higher sustainability. That being said, your sustainability will still be lower than a martial who focuses on continuous damage. Where you trade down is potency. You don't get the ceiling of your effect as often as you would if you were focusing on spike damage. Your effects generally don't have a huge swing in the course of a single turn. That's not to say you have no swings, and make it still critically fail against what you do, and things can go really well for you. It just takes a bit more luck for you to get those spikes when you're focusing on continuous damage, whereas spike damage is built for those spikes. Spike damage will always feel like it has a bigger swing than continuous damage. In that way, spike and continuous damage often come at the cost of one another. This is that tension I was talking about. The higher up you go in potency, the more you're going to lower your sustainability and often one of efficiency and reliability. That is going to have a cost for your continuous damage. The more you do spike damage, the less you do continuous damage. The more you do continuous damage, the less you do spike damage. Spellcasters, however, generally have quite a bit of control over exactly where on the spectrum they want to land. This is true both during character building when you're picking spells, picking feats, picking focus spells, picking your subclass, and it's also true at the table. You can definitely build a character who can pick and choose between spike damage and continuous damage, but of course you'll be paying the cost in some other way. You might not spike as high as somebody focused on spike damage, and you may not have as much continuous damage for every single combat of the day as somebody who focused on continuous damage. But you will still have a good degree of control over where you end up, and you have a lot of flexibility. Future Mathfinder here, I realized I didn't talk about one really important part of spike damage versus continuous damage. Which one of these is better? The truth is, both of them are really good in their own way, and any optimized Pathfinder party needs both. The value of continuous damage should be obvious because it is measured as DPR. It's that round after round damage that actually puts a clock to the fight. It's what lets you know that within 3 to 5 turns, this fight's going to be over, and that's about how many resources I need to allot for this fight. Continuous damage has naturally high reliability, and that means that you can expect this to mitigate the randomness of the d20. Swings will matter on a single turn, but over the course of a combat, your damage will be close to your DPR. Spike damage, on the other hand, is high risk, high reward. There's a substantial risk that you do nothing. There's even a substantial risk that after 3 turns, you're underperforming compared to your DPR. But you're also potentially overperforming. You're potentially taking a minion out of combat a whole turn earlier than they would have. You're potentially ending a boss fight a whole turn earlier than it otherwise would have. Doing this means you're creating scenarios that the enemies can't react to. This means that if an enemy goes down faster, your party needs less healing. This means that if the enemy has their own ways of boosting their survivability, maybe healing of their own, maybe kiting away from you, you're giving them less agency over it because your spikes might randomly take them out of the action economy without them even having a chance to react to it. So yes, any good party will have both. You need continuous damage to have a high reliability way of clocking the enemy, and you need spike damage to make sure you have given yourself the room to get lucky, to get those high swings, and to take enemies out in a way that's profitable for your party instead of just performing at average performance all the time. Future Mathfinder out. The next major piece of coupling is between reliability and a lot of the other factors. On the previous slides, you may have noticed that all the things that offensive spellcasters are expected to do, targeting a variety of defenses, bringing in a variety of damage types, having some brute force options, these naturally increase your reliability. That's not to say that's the only way to build a blaster caster, but if you're building a blaster caster who wants to focus on reliability, those fundamentals are going to be pretty important for you. An arcane spellcaster will just naturally win in this regard. They will always have very high reliability because the arcane spell list is just naturally good in this regard. They have the ability to target all 4 defenses. They have most of the damage types in the game. They have all of the best brute force options in the game. That's not to say the other spell lists cannot be good blasters with good reliability though. It just means that when you have one of those spell lists, if you're building a blaster with reliability as a priority, you have to look to your class features. You have to look to your class feats. You have to look to your granted spells. See if all these factors give you ways to target different saving throws. See if all these factors give you more ways of forcing the enemy to make more rolls. All of these can increase your reliability, and other casters generally do tend to get more of these features to offset Arcane's natural reliability. Another place where reliability will naturally arise from is efficiency. If you compare the reliability of spells individually in a vacuum without looking at how they fit into a single turn or that turn fits into a single combat, this may not be obvious. As an example, consider an Imperial Sorcerer versus an Elemental Sorcerer. So this is a case where you're spending all 3 actions to make one reliable spell. That is, the Imperial Sorcerer casts Ancestral Memories to reduce the enemy's saving throw, and then cast a 2-action spell, and then you compare that to a 2+1 action turn. So an Elemental Sorcerer going that same 2-action spell followed by a Elemental Toss. If you compare 2-action spell to 2-action spell, the Imperial Sorcerer will appear to have higher reliability. But if you look at these 2 turns, the Elemental Sorcerer has higher reliability. When you have 2 separate d20 rolls being made, the chances of you doing 0 damage, where the enemy both crit succeeds and then you miss your attack roll, become considerably lower than the -1, -2, or -3 to the enemy's saving throw that Imperial Sorcerer gave. Likewise, across multiple rolls, the chance of you getting average damage, your DPR for instance, is higher. Now, of course, the Imperial Sorcerer does win in potency because you are much likelier to stick that failure or critical failure effect. That goes back to my previous slide where I talked about how potency is often the inverse of some of these factors. But even so, it's worth noting, when you look at a turn-by-turn breakdown or a combat-by-combat breakdown, efficiency naturally leads to high reliability, and these 2 are often synergetic aspects of a build. A really good example of efficiency leading to reliability is the Silence and Snow Witch. You have a 1-action Hex cantrip that pokes for some damage. You have all of your 2-action spells, some of which will be focus spells, many of which will be slotted spells. You have Cackle, which can help you sustain a spell that you cast in a prior turn, and leaves 3 actions free to go for something like sustain another spell and also cast a 2-action spell. You can also sneak in reaction-based offenses like Brine Dragon's Bile between your turns. Your familiar can also leave difficult terrain all around the battlefield. All of these combined means you're kind of overloading the enemy's defenses with your efficiency. They're making so many saving throws against you. You're making so many attack rolls against them. There's so many effects you're sticking onto them without even doing a roll. Because of your efficiency, your reliability is naturally very high. So remember that efficiency and reliability often go hand in hand. If you're building a blaster that's naturally leaning towards one of these, you will often end up filling out the other as well. So that's all I have to say on the topic of coupling between various factors. The next thing I wanted to consider is versatility and how much of it you can really afford to lose. So spellcasters in Pathfinder tend to be innately versatile. Arcane and primal spellcasters even more so than divine and occult ones. When I say you're losing versatility by being a blaster, it often means you're choosing to lose it. Often, not always. Exceptions do exist. The Psychic, for example, is just inherently less versatile than any other spellcaster who has more slots than them. I already talked earlier about how because you're making this choice, you have to make sure it's worth it. You're gaining in other aspects. What I didn't talk about is how much versatility you lose depends on the spell list you started with. If you're a divine spellcaster, you're not losing that much versatility by focusing on blasting. You just need to make sure your party's survivability is covered, and you just need to make sure that buffing is covered by someone. And you can still do it, somebody else can still do it, it's just a little bit of value you're losing. So you don't have to do too much to make your blasting worth it. Conversely, an arcane spellcaster, especially in a party where the only other casters are divine or occult, might be covering several bases for the party. They'll be covering blasting, crowd control, debuffing, some of the buffing that the party expects them to do. They might be covering utility on the battlefield, like casting spells like Propulsive Breeze. They might be covering silver bullets, like anti-invisibility and anti-flight spells. If you're choosing to focus on blasting primarily, you need to make sure it's really worth it, because you're trading away a lot of versatility for that. The corollary of this is also true. The more you're struggling to make it worth it, the more you should consider having backup options that aren't blasting. For example, you want to be a mentalism wizard, and mentalism wizards don't really make for great blasters. You have to make sure you have backup options. You can't be just a blaster when you do this. You have to have something to do when your blasts are not cutting it. So what are some good backup options? Thinking from a thematic perspective, I like to pick my backup options as being something my blaster would actually pick. So for example, if I'm an arcane or primal blaster, there's a high chance I'm relying on a lot of elemental themed spells, so I'm going to lean back on crowd control as my backup options because elemental spells naturally tend to have a lot of that. If I'm an arcane or occult blaster, there's a chance I'm using a lot of will targeting spells or other forms of spells that have debuffing riders. So I'm going to pair full-on debuffing with no worry about blasting as my backup option. Likewise, healing tends to be a really good backup option for divine and primal blasters. And finally, buffing tends to be a good backup option for divine and occult blasters. So just remember to look at this tension for your character. Not all casters can be built equally blastery. Some characters can focus on blasting 95% of the time. Some have to be closer to 60% of the time, and that's okay. This build variety is what makes Pathfinder fun. Just make sure that you're evaluating how much versatility you lost and whether the blasting you gain makes the loss worth it. The last factor I wanted to talk about is how does a blaster caster fit into a party? Remember that Pathfinder optimization is never done in a vacuum. The rest of your party exists. Your character needs to fit well with the rest of your party if you want to play in an optimized fashion. Blasters occupy the same spot in a party that a ranged martial would. That's why they have similar roles with a bit of texture that makes them different. So what kind of a party would prefer having a blaster over, say, just another ranged martial? First, consider parties where the frontliners are focused on defense and control, and then the backliner does damage. For example, let's say your frontline looks like Redemption Champion and War Priest Cleric. Let's say the Cleric is delivering the Swing Ripper special of being a wrestler. This party is excellent at keeping survivability high. The Champion mitigates damage pretty easily and efficiently. The Cleric makes sure that enemies can't easily break through to the backline. However, the frontline is a little lacking in damage. Now your backline might have a Precision Ranger and a Arcane Draconic Sorcerer, and these two will now be your damage dealers. The Draconic Sorcerer here is better than just having a second range martial, for instance. The Draconic Sorcerer has the Arcane spell list and can complement the Cleric's Divine spell list. They can bring utility where the Cleric can't. They can add in reactions to help the Cleric defend the party, and they can blast, which makes them excellent choices for dealing damage from a distance. Then consider parties where you have a martial who is directly designed to boost the performance of offensively oriented spellcasters. In this scenario, you can just bring a blaster caster. Say you have a Scoundrel Rogue, and that Scoundrel Rogue has the Distracting Feint feat. This character is excellent at debuffing enemies in a way that spellcasters can benefit from, so you may as well take advantage of it. Likewise, consider that you may have an Outwit Ranger with all the Recall Knowledge feats, and with those they can help you find damage weaknesses, weak saving throws, etc. It's pretty natural to just build a blaster caster and benefit from all these things. Then consider parties where you're not consistently covering the spike versus continuous damage spectrum. For example, if in your party there is a Magus or a Gunslinger, that character is very focused on spike damage and not so much on continuous damage, so you might bring a blaster that's good at continuous damage to the table. If your other damage dealer is a Flurry Ranger, you might do the opposite. You might bring a spike damage blaster to the table. And the amazing thing about a blaster caster is that you can still do the other thing with some of your other spell slots. If you bring a continuous damage focused character, you can still get those big spikes, and vice versa. So you can bring in a flexible character that covers for the other damage dealer's weakness, while also being able to play to their strengths whenever it matters. Remember, however, that you're still a spellcaster. It is polite and good etiquette to consider what the rest of your party might need from you. Healing, silver bullets, out-of-combat utility, other such factors are often expected of spellcasters, and you should be polite and try to cover these with scrolls and low-rank spell slots. Both of these tend to not come out of your max-rank spell slots, so you may as well use them to help your party out. That being said, still be firm about your boundaries. Offering to cover healing for your friends does not mean you'll be their pocket healer. There's still the expectation that they need to be good at protecting themselves and maintaining their own survivability, and if they truly are not, they need to split the burden on healing because you didn't sign up to be a dedicated healer. Make it clear that these are things you're bringing for emergencies, and that your primary role is still blasting. With all that context out of the way, Here is me finally introducing the Blastercaster rubric. This is how I'll be evaluating Blastercasters in part 2 of this video series. The first category of grades is the fundamentals: defense targeting variety, brute forcing through defenses, damage variety, rider effects, and the value you can generate from low rank spell slots. The second category, given twice the weight of the fundamentals, is versatility and what you trade for it. The first factor is how much versatility do you actually lose. And then there's the remaining 4 axes: efficiency, potency, reliability, and sustainability. I gave this part of the sheet a higher weight than the fundamentals because ultimately those fundamentals come from your base spell list. And we all know that blasters are about more than their base spell list. Those just define your foundation. You still need more than a foundation to make a good damage dealer. Each individual factor will be given a mark between 1 and 4. So 1 being very poor, 2 being 3 being good, and 4 being excellent. We will add up all these factor totals and half the weight for the fundamentals to get a final grade out of 30, and this is how I'll be evaluating my blasters against one another. I'll be sharing a copy of this rubric in the video description so you can use it to grade your own blaster casters, but you'll have to wait for my grades until video 2. So that will be all for today's video, folks. Truthfully, I'm a little surprised this ended up being such a long video. I was expecting to cover the rubric within the first 10 minutes and then just jump straight into evaluating blasters. There were 2 things that made me decide to make it multi-parter. First, I realized that as I'm introducing the rubric, I introduce a lot of caveats and a lot of considerations that don't fit cleanly on a rubric. And secondly, there's just a lot of good Blastercaster builds to consider in Pathfinder. As of the time I'm recording this, I've looked at 10, and by the time part 2 comes out, there might be more than 10. So it just made sense to be a multi-parter, and then I figured I would stick a 3-parter where I go into details about individual builds that I consider excellent Blastercasters. While you're waiting for those parts to come out though, if you like this content, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so that I know that you like this content and I can keep making more of it. Consider joining a channel membership. It is both a direct way to support me without worrying about advertisements and also to get access to unique perks. For example, the build guide that'll be coming out with part 3 of this video. I have been Mathfinder, folks, and I hope you all have a wonderful time until the next time I see you.